Thank you. I'd like to start off by thanking the center, especially to JD, to inviting me. I've been to a lot of these laser talks before, and it's certainly an honor to be up here. And thank you to all of you for coming. So I want to start with what I think is the big question. Why am I here? You might notice, you might think that I'm talking about the real big question, like why are any of us here? But actually the question that I'm talking about for this purpose is why am I here as a neuroscientist who's studying art? What is neuroscience? What is studying of the brain? What does that have to do with studying art in general? What do those things have to offer each other? And this is a question that I asked myself when I was starting my PhD in neuroscience, because it's not so immediately obvious when you think about it. But I'm hoping to show you today that both of these fields do indeed have a lot to offer each other. They do indeed have potential to actually advance each other. So I want to begin by talking about how art advances neuroscience, and then later part in the talk, I'll talk about how neuroscience can help advance art. So many of you may not know, but actually one of the oldest aspects of psychology has to do with aesthetics. It has to do with studying of beauty, it has to do with studying of art forms, and it's actually the second, back then it was called Empirical Aesthetics, which is the second oldest branch of psychology. It was invented by Gustav Fechner, who was actually the father of psychology itself. So right away, there's this immediate link between studying the brain and studying what we like, studying beauty, etc. So it's not something that's so foreign. So how do we do this? How did the empirical aesthetics folks do this? And folks that still do it now, they would look at a stimulus and they would look at what kind of perception that you have upon looking at the stimulus. And one example would be that you, let's say, look at some kind of figure that has a certain amount of balance, and you ask an individual, okay, what do you feel about this? How does this make you feel? Do you like this? Do you like it or not? And while this is really important, I feel like one thing that's missing is what's actually happening in between, which is the neural activity. So this link between the neural activity and the perception is actually where neuroscience comes in. So what does happen when we look inside the brain when we're talking about aesthetics? One of the first findings that we kind of see has to do with symmetry. So in this experiment, there's these two different dot diagrams, and you can notice that this one has some order, has some symmetry, has some like complexity to it, and this one is completely random. So what the experimenters wanted to see is what is the difference when you look at one from the other. And what they find is that the brain has a dedicated circuitry for processing symmetry. And this is what you see in the brain. You don't have to worry about exactly what this area is, but I just want to explain to you what you're seeing here is basically the activation of looking at this minus the activation of looking at this. So what you end up getting is like what is crucially the activation for looking at something that makes itself symmetric. And you find that there is a dedicated neural circuitry in the brain for symmetry, and I think that's right away, that's a really kind of profound and important thing. This is something that's been so fundamental in art, and now we see that it actually has a crucial part in the brain. It's like a huge part of the visual processing hierarchy. So, but what about when we look at art? So what happens then? So when we see beauty in particular. And when I say that, you might think of going to a gallery. You might think of this image, somebody sitting, watching, having a nice experience at a gallery. But actually what happens is, in the lab, is more like this. You're laying down prone in a giant metal tube, and you're being portrayed some images. And we can talk later about if this is the most ideal and best setting to do this. But it's the best we can do, but we can discuss it later. Sorry, it's kind of on a auto. OK. Yes, so here's what you see when you look at brain imaging through what I had just shown you before. And don't worry about the areas. I just wanted you to know that this is the imaging that you see when you look at a piece of art or any kind of visual art. And while this is all important, I think what in order for us to really define in neuroscience like a fundamental aesthetic response, I think we have to expand beyond just vision as we saw that there are much more aspects to aesthetics than just vision. There's touch, if we hear something, it's beautiful. If we smell something, that's beautiful. If we eat good food, that's surely beautiful. So what happens when we look at this activity, but across all of these senses, you see that different areas come up. And what's important for us is to see what is the overlap between these areas, in that, like, which of these areas are activated in everything. And that kind of gives us a little bit of a hint about what parts of the brain are actually activated during an aesthetic response. So I'll just give you a general, so these are the kind of areas, and I'll give you, I guess it already came up here, just a general understanding of what the function or overall function of these areas is. This area has to do with reward, learning from reward. The areas here have to do with internal sensation. This area has to do with the feeling of reward, and this area has to do with the connection of sensory inputs to value. So these are all things that seem to be really important in no matter what kind of sensory modality that you're looking at. So, like I said, there appears to be a network of shared neural correlates for aesthetic appraisal and value. So just the point that I wanted to make here is that, so this is, in neuroscience, this is something that we have found not only across all these areas, but also when people think about when mathematicians think about mathematical beauty, when people think about good moral decisions, when people think about how much money means to them, erotica, etc. So like these kind of areas are shared all across aesthetic appraisal, as well as other things that have value in our lives. So what I'm trying to convey to you, hopefully, is that there is this shared kind of network that is not just designed for art in specific, but it's designed for anything that we like or that we value. And so this idea has been, this idea that I've put forward has been out there in the neuroscience field, but it hasn't really culminated into anything. Like, people tend to agree, like, okay, yes, this is the case, but what me and my mentor Norberto, who's sitting here, we wanted to do is to kind of put this into a model, and we wanted to make it testable, and we wanted to see, okay, well, if this really is the case, then what can we do? Can we make a model? Can we make predictions? And then can we do experiments to test those predictions? So this is our model. Don't worry about the nitty-gritty details. I just want you to think back to the 4 areas that I talked about and their major representative roles. And what I want you to understand is that basically what we're doing is our model is encapsulating the different aspects of this brain regions. And that basically forms this basis. So I'll only present one result of the model for the sake of time, but it does produce a lot of interesting predictions. It produces a lot of interesting ideas for experiments and confirms some things that we've already known before. But one thing that I would like to present to you, this model predicts individuality. So in this simulation, we have 3 individuals that have different motivations or different internal states for how much they want or like a certain aesthetic variable, so how much they're looking for in their environment. The blue being the highest individual, the red being the lowest, and green in the middle. And what we see is that when we look at the results, these different individuals have different aesthetic learned values. So they end up learning different aesthetic values for these principles. And what that basically means is that it leads to this individuality from the perceiver within. So it's not only that what is out there in the world that decides what you like, what you don't like. It's about what are your current needs, what is your context, and how that changes day to day. And that kind of determines our trajectory and what we end up liking today, what we end up liking in 5 years. So this model kind of predicts that, and I thought that was a really interesting thing that we're now doing experiments to test out. Just to wrap up, what has neuroscience learned from aesthetics? So before I present this slide, I know a lot of my colleagues here who are artists might find this a little bit controversial or contentious, but I assure you this is something I'm doing on purpose. I don't mean to have a dogmatic viewpoint, but I want to encourage some discussion. So please take it with a grain of salt. So when I what I am advocating is that that it's all in the brain. Everything from how we learn and how we process art is not something that exists in some sphere outside of ourselves, but we have to understand as neuroscientists is that the brain is where all this is happening, so that the brain is where we must look for it. So this is what is kind of termed a naturalistic viewpoint. And as I showed you previously, aesthetic appraisal is rooted in fundamental brain mechanisms. These mechanisms are shared by other equally complex and profound human abilities. So it's not unique, but it is just as profound as art. And understanding these aesthetic response has implications for a range of human behavior. So if you are looking at an aesthetic response and you see how individuals respond in terms of their emotion, understanding that is not only important for, okay, how did this person feel about this art, it's important for how did this person feel in general, and it applies to all fields of neuroscience as well. And I feel like in that sense, looking at the aesthetic experience is almost a microcosm of neuroscience in general because it is such a broad spectrum of human behavior. So the second part now that I want to briefly talk about is how does neuroscience inform our advanced art? And I'll be frank that the conversation hasn't really been equal on both sides. I think we've taken more than we've given, and I think maybe in the discussion we'll talk about that. But I think we have made some interesting contributions. One of these is a study that we did in our lab where we looked at any aesthetic biases that existed in painters across history. So we wanted to see if different painters were painting according to these neuroaesthetic principles that have already been defined. So what we did was we took portraits, we took randomly shot photos. This is a picture of Norberto, our model, and we basically looked at how much balance, one of the variables was how much balance was in each of these. And what we found was that paintings, while they have more balance than quickly snapped photos here, they do have less balance than frontal poses. So this shows that artists are doing a composition. They're actually composing with intent. And what we found interestingly is that all these artists are not composing in the same way. They're composing in different subspaces. So for example, Messina might be composing his paintings with a certain amount of balance in a subspace that's different than Castagno or Berruguete. So this leads us to kind of see that overlying theme of individuality that exists in aesthetics. The other thing that I think neuroscience and technology in general is lending to art is these new opportunities for creativity. So this is, many of you might be familiar with the original composition, 7 by Kandinsky. But this is an illustration. I'm not sure if it's going to play now or. Okay. So as you can see, so this is just extremely recent. This is a Twitter user who basically uses neural networks to try and understand different things. And what he wanted to see was so our brains have this really profound ability to seek out depth. And our brain will try to find it anywhere, but what if you force a neural network with the same rules to try and do that? And that's what the result here that you were seeing is what you end up seeing, and it kind of gives you this new window into seeing art in a different way. And I think once you look at it this way, you'll gain a new appreciation for the kind of depth that could be possible in the original Kandinsky. Lastly, one other way that neuroscience can inform art is through art therapy. So art therapy has emerged as a really important field lately, and one really important lesson that it can take from neuroscience is by having an understanding of how diseases work in the mind, you can actually tailor different forms of art therapy based on that. So it can help with, art therapy has been shown to help with addiction, trauma, depression, cognitive decline. And I have to shout out to Julia, who's in the audience here, who's been working a lot on this. So I think it's a really important field, and it's something that certainly wouldn't be possible without the knowledge that we've gained from neuroscience. So in conclusion, the study of brain and behavior is inseparable. As you can see that from the beginning to the end, in every aspect that I've talked about, studying art is nothing different than studying the brain and studying behavior in general. Both fields, I hope to have shown you that both fields continue and will continue to advance each other, but we are far from understanding everything. And I just want to make one last point, is that what happens when we do understand everything? And because I feel like there's kind of a fear in the artistic community that, understanding and looking to figure out art will take away the mysticism and the magic from it. And this, one of the primary critics of neuroaesthetics said neuroaesthetics is killing your soul. I think I have to disagree, and the way I can kind of drive that point home is by giving you another kind of personal anecdote. So this is a painting, Sunrise by Monet. A lot of you might be familiar with it. I'm sure a lot of us, including me, find this beautiful. But personally, looking at it from the viewpoint of a neuroscientist, I can my understanding of how the different visual tricks that were used in this painting to make the sun appear brighter than it is, even though it's the same luminance, or to make the shimmer appear even though nothing is actually moving in the painting, actually increases my appreciation for the painting rather than diminishes the magic. And I hope it does the same for you. Thank you.